World Population Day, and also the release of the new UN population projection data. Thank you, Professor James, for inviting me. Thank you, Professor Skirbekk, for organizing everything and for having me here, and also to Professor Kogi for making this trip possible. I will be speaking. I worked quite diversely in different issues, different themes in demography. And one topic I've been focusing on in recent years have been on fertility. And I've been trying to set up a new institute in Oslo, in Norway, on focusing on both the demographic and biological and social determinants of low fertility and changes in fertility patterns. And the motivation for why we're currently focusing on fertility is a graph that many of you probably know quite well. So since the 1950s, the globe from around 5 children per woman to around 2.5 or less children per woman in recent years. And understanding why this is the case and why fertility might continue to decline globally, but also locally in different regions and contexts, and why many attempts to perhaps reverse the ongoing fertility trends, which are attempted in many low fertility settings, might be difficult to implement or less effective. So this graph shows the. Can you see my pointer? No. Let's see. There's this. Well, anyway, so this shows the latest round of the NFHS. Thank you. And it shows the very large differences in fertility observed in India. In for example, Bihar, you have the highest fertility in India with a TFR of 3.0. A region close by in Sikkim has only 1.1 children per woman. And why do we observe these large differences within a relatively short geographic distance? That is something that could be of interest to study in more detail in the years to come, and whether India will experience a fertility convergence, which many demographers believe at least partially could be the case. So the point of my talk is twofold. This is to understand why are we having fewer children in the world, why is fertility declining, and also what are the biological changes in the capacity to reproduce, and what are the social factors, what are the social key factors driving later and lower fertility. I will give many examples from Europe and Norway, partly because Norway is my home country, but also because Norway has some of the best data on reproduction in the world. We have data on the entire population linked to both social and biological national level data, which is quite unique. So this shows one example of a fertility change that has occurred since 1986 to 2020 in Norway. And you see that in 1986, most women in Norway, as in many other countries, had children quite early relative to now. They had the peak fertility occurred in the 20s. Since the 1980s, during the 1990s, fertility has been postponed. So now peak fertility occurs in the early 30s. There's been a strong decrease in not only teenage fertility. Teenage fertility is almost unheard of in Norway. It used to be very high. Or quite high. It used to be over 16, going back to the 50s, and now it's fallen down to below 2. You have peak fertility occurring in the early 30s, and increases in fertility not only in the late 30s but also in the early and later 40s, although to quite low levels. This also correlates to a strong increase in the percentages of live births to mothers age 35 plus in Norway, and now more than 20% of all births occur to mothers aged 35 plus. So these were the trends. And when asked, so I will focus on biological issues in a bit, but when asked what is the preferred age for first birth, when the general population is asked what is the best age to have a child for both men and women, you find that people also that is both men and women, answered that the ideal age of first birth should occur after the age of 27 roughly, and not later than the age of 37. So roughly a decade seen as optimal. And these are the shares of, so there's been a strong increase in childlessness in Europe and in Asia, East Asia in particular. Highest is Japan, where more than 1 in 4 women age 40 are now childless, followed by Singapore, and then continental and southern European countries, including Germany, Italy, Spain, Finland. But there's also examples of countries in former socialist, former Soviet countries, including Russia, Lithuania, and many other countries, where fertility, even if overall fertility is quite low, childlessness is not that high, and the reason is that most women have one child, but many do not have subsequent children. So there could be different reasons for why fertility is low in, quite low in different countries. Some countries you have a high proportion of childless, other countries you have high proportions of women not proceeding from the first birth. There's also an interesting gender dimension, and this is, I think, quite important and something that has happened in recent years in Norway. So childlessness used to be, almost all research on childlessness used to be on women, much stronger for men. Almost 1 out of 3 men in Norway are now childless at the end of their reproductive years, and the increase has been there also for women, but much weaker, going from 10 to slightly above 15%. So childlessness is increasingly a male phenomenon. And this is important for many reasons, including that there is, if you look at, for example, the relationship between adult health and childlessness in Norway, you find that the relationship is actually stronger for men than for women. So childlessness can have stronger implications for adult male health than for adult female health. And the reasons are likely to be related to social support or meaning, purpose in life, or health behavior risk factors, where men who are childless might take greater risks and end up living shorter lives. I'd like to give a big perspective, and this is an example from Denmark, where we look at gross and net fertility. Gross fertility is the number of children of both sexes, the blue line, who are born on average, and the red line shows the number of children surviving to mid-reproductive periods, to the mid-reproductive period. And what you find is that if you go back to the beginning of the demographic transition, 1775, you find that around 2 children survived out of slightly above 4 in Denmark. So this was a period of stability in population terms, where although we had quite large families, half of the children, slightly more, died before reproducing themselves. And as mortality fell, the blue and the red lines gradually converged, because most children, one had survived to mid-reproductive periods. But in the meantime, you had a period where you just saw net fertility being above 2. And this was the entire demographic transition. This is the reason why we have population growth in the world, because this occurred to countries all over the world. In Denmark, it's quite easy. The population increased from 1 to 5 million. It increased by a factor of 5 during the demographic transition, which was quite typical for the European case. European populations increased on average around a factor of 4, much less in some countries such as France, where it roughly doubled, as you can see on the French diagram here. But did not increase very high, and the reason is it has to do with the fact that mortality declined slowly. So populations, women had time to adjust and take into account that the greater proportion of the women are likely to, greater proportion of the children are likely to survive. However, in other parts of the world, including in India, including in China, Singapore, Kuwait, for examples given here, the changes were different for 2 reasons. One, gross fertility, the number of children one had was not 4 to 5, which was the case in the European setting, where you had the so-called European marital pattern. One married late had high levels of premarital celibacy, and significant portions of populations never married and had children. In many other parts of the world, gross fertility was higher, and one had 6-7 children on average in many countries. And when mortality fell, it also fell much quicker. And this implied that one had a much quicker increase in population size, meaning that unlike the European case, where populations increased by a factor of 4, accounting for immigration to Australia, New Zealand, the US, Canada, and other countries, you had, in many countries, including India and China, a much stronger population increase. At the same time, in recent years, such as in Singapore, fertility has fallen to levels much below what has been seen anywhere in Europe, and same with Hong Kong, same with Taiwan, same with also now different parts of India. So you have a more extreme change occurring, which makes studying Asia particularly interesting. How many children could a woman have? Well, it's difficult to say. There's enormous variation. One often states that natural fertility, given that one has unprotected sex during one's reproductive life, marries partners young, one ends up with perhaps 7 to 10 children per woman on average. About half of women in communities where this occurs, like the Hutterites in the US religious community, which has this kind of partnering patterns, have the last child in the ages 41 to 50, and very few, only around 1 to 3%, remain childless. So biological childlessness, based on these estimates, tend to be very low. But there's huge variation between individuals. And according to the Guinness Book of World Records, Valentina Vasiliev, who was alive in the 18th century, had 69 children. She was pregnant 27 times, gave birth to 16 pairs of twins, 7 sets of triplets, and 4 sets of quadruplets. So fertility can be very high for some. But on average, 7 to 10 children is what commonly is stated as natural fertility. There has been widespread concern, at least in the media, about declining biological ability to reproduce. So, and one, at least in many Western countries, has been much concerned about a potential decline in semen quality. And this is an example from a study that looks at North America, Europe, which arguably finds a declining semen quality over time, over the 20th century. But these studies, we do not really have good representative data on semen quality. Data on semen quality is often taken from fecundity centers, fertility centers, and that's a select population who visits these clinics. So it's difficult to state what the actual trend is. And even if these trends are true, they're still quite a lot higher than the cutoff for what is seen as sufficient semen quality for reproduction which is 15 million per million semen per milliliter. So it's difficult to state. What we do have much better data on is data on the age of first menstruation, and we do have historical data in Norway going back to the early 19th century or mid-19th century, finding that it has decreased by 3 years over time, from around 16 to around age 13 and below. We also know that the average health has been improving for both men and women in the key reproductive ages, and we do have much better reproductive technologies than earlier. So, for example, in Norway, more than 4 or 5% of all children are born using assisted reproductive technologies. On average, at least one child in each school class in Norway has been born through the use of ART. However, social factors might be important, and reproduction has been postponed to later life, where fecundity tends to be lower. There are many reasons for this, and social factors are the primary drivers. Most individuals prefer to have children. Preferred childlessness tends to be below 10% for almost all countries, except men in Austria and Netherlands, and for women in all countries when asked. So very few prefer to be childless. But there are so many things to do before having children, which takes more and more time. And this includes includes education, finding a secure job, getting married, having enough money, buying a house, a car, spending a year traveling, realizing oneself, playing the dating field, finding the perfect partner, moving in together. It all takes more and more time than it used to. And this is something which some of us have been working on a lot in the past. Educational increases. It has increased tremendously over recent years. Schooling ages increase and career establishments take longer and longer. At the same time, peak earnings for where you have data occurs later and later in life. Historical data suggests that one, for example, from Finland or England, suggests that one reached one's peak earnings around the age of 30, and now it typically happens in one's late 50s or 60s, way later than one's peak reproductive years. So it's economically more difficult than earlier. It's 1 in 562 are also finding a partner given with desired characteristics, given what one prefers. According to a UK-based study, it's very difficult to find the perfect partner. Dating sites have no incentive to create stable partnerships. That is against the business idea. And new factors such as education and income matters more and more for likelihood of marriage, personality traits, physical strength even. At the same time as many prefer traditional gender norms. Even in Norway, one survey suggests that 7 out of 10 women prefer men to be the main breadwinner, which can be hard, and in more and more cases, men earn less than women. So one has to adjust one's mating preferences. This is an example from Taiwan. And you find that childlessness is very different by men and women. Men with higher education are less likely to be childless. Women with higher education are more likely to be childless than those with less education. There's been changes in marriage patterns. More people cohabit, fewer people marry. Even in countries that traditionally had none of this, such as Chile, Costa Rica, it has become the dominant norm. So it could increase also in countries that are traditionally very conservative in these matters. Cohabitation, non-marital childbearing might increase. There might be new forms of family formation. This is examples from Sweden, where you looked at same-sex couples, and you find that women with wives tend to have an increasing childbearing. This is not the case for same-sex male couples who tend to have very low fertility. This might play an increasing role if it constitutes a large proportion of those of the partnerships in a country. Earnings, housing prices matter a lot. This is again an example from Norway. Accounting for earnings growth, housing prices have tripled since the mid-1990s, making it harder to establish oneself. This is certainly also very relevant for India, where housing prices have increased tremendously in recent years. So summing up, it takes a long time. One wants to do a lot of things, and one ends up with challenges. Antenatal policies, in contrast to pronatal policies, could often be quite effective. This is an example from Iran, where it decreased from 6 to 2 children per woman in just over a decade or so. Similar examples of very effective antenatal policies have been shown from Bangladesh, and you find, unlike pronatal policies, which wants to increase fertility, antenatal policies tend to be more likely to have strong effects. Example from Hong Kong, which went from very high to one of the world's lowest fertility levels. Lowest currently being South Korea with 0.8 children. So if I had to bet, I think fertility will likely fluctuate at fairly low levels in more and more world regions. And new factors coming up, including, for example, climate change, is likely to depress fertility further. This is whether this will have consequences for the world. I think there are many positive likely consequences, but I also think there are major concerns, especially from my own profession, the economist, about the implications for global productivity. But for the first time in history now that India has dropped below fertility replacement levels, the world's 10 largest economies have below replacement fertility levels. So actually it has increased to the world's 15 largest economies. I didn't have time to update the graph, but the vast majority of what's produced in the world is now being produced in countries with below replacement fertility. And if you're interested in some of these topics, as a little bit of advertisement, I did write a book which just came out now, termed Decline and Prosper, on why we have a lot fewer children and some of the issues we should investigate further, and why the consequences might be possibly more positive than many people would think. So and like most past research in this field, which tends to be very disciplinary specific, some are experts on, say, semen quality or education, or I try to merge everything together in one integrated analysis. And one word on aging. There's a lot of concern about aging in the world, but I think it's extremely important to stress that, for example, the world's oldest country, Japan, also has very good health. So if you look at the age, not when you turn 65, but the age when you have the same health as a global 65-year-old, you find that this occurs in the late 70s in Japan, while it occurs in the mid-40s in Papua New Guinea. There's tremendous difference across countries, India being around 60, which means India has a lot to go on in terms of improving health and thereby dealing better with population aging. If you look at the old age dependency ratio, which is the proportion 65 plus over those aged 20 to 64, you find that countries such as Sub-Saharan Africa, most of Asia, tend to be relatively young, have a low dependency ratio. But one should not do this, one shouldn't use this, one should rather look at when people get old in terms of when they have poor health. And if you account for health, if you don't say a person is old at the age of 65, but when a person has relatively poor health, you find a completely different world rank ordering. You find that India's actually not India's sort of mid-level. Several European countries with demographically much older populations are younger because they have better health. They invested more in lifelong health, and some countries have neither, including former USSR Soviet countries, where they both have an old population and poor health, and they have very poor health-adjusted dependency ratio. So to sum up, global fertility has been cut in half in just the last 50 years, and it's continuing to fall. Lower mortality, education, higher cost of childbearing, changes in the labor market, new roles of women have likely contributed to these changes, and people prefer fewer children than they used to. There is a lack of examples of countries that have managed to reverse this fertility trend, and most future events are likely to if anything, depress fertility even further. So I think if low fertility will probably be a trend of the future increasingly, and also, as mentioned earlier, it might be less of a concern, but rather a more positive development than what maybe others believe. So thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to any comments or questions.